Hi, everybody. Nice to see you here. I have everybody on auto mute just in case. If anybody wants to speak at any point, they could indicate it by raising their hand or by writing something in the chat. So this is live. I wanted to give everybody fair warning. So if you do decide to speak after the lecture, just know that this will be recorded and posted to YouTube. It's nice to see a little bit of a crowd here. I see more people still coming in. I'm expecting 70 or more people. We'll see if they show up. So let's begin. Um, First, I wanted to welcome everybody to this live listening party. In a few minutes, we'll be listening to a talk from Dr. Ellie Ragland on hysteria, which complements some of the topics that are being discussed in a course that I'm teaching at Aga Khan University in Karachi, Pakistan, in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, which explains the presence of many students from that course here. It's also of interest to a few of you who are in the Psychoanalysis Pakistan circle. I see a number of you here, actually, which it's really nice. Um, uh, yes, maybe 4 or 5 so far from the circle, which is really nice to see. This talk helps to support us in Pakistan as we move toward the Lacanian school. And finally, this talk from Dr. Ragland helps to foreground, I think, her much anticipated book on hysteria, which should be out, I believe it's with Routledge, within the year. So really looking forward to that. This is one guest lecture of many that will occur during this semester for Psychoanalysis Pakistan. I hope that those of you who are here, if you have an interest in psychoanalysis, maybe you'll join us for a few of these guest lectures from Doctors Steen van Hoel, Leon Brenner, Daniel Tutt, Arka Chattopadhyay, Todd McGowan, Alenka Supancic, and many others who have planned to join us before the end of the year. You can follow us or get involved by visiting our website, which is www.psychoanalysispakistan.com. We help to organize cartels, which are small psychoanalytic study groups. And we have a very exciting international conference coming up next summer, which follows the question which had set me in specific to work in a cartel in Pakistan. The question is Psychoanalysis Pakistan. I leave the question mark in suspense. Today's talk will not include any visuals unless I decide to share my screen and maybe bring up some visuals while the audio recording is playing. And Ellie may or may not be joining us due to issues with the technology and the time zones. She may be able to join us for the discussion at the end, she mentioned. So we'll see if she makes it, but I invite you all to engage with this as if it's a radio program or a podcast, and you can go about what you're doing and play it in the background. I actually think this is quite convenient for us, since in a way, psychoanalysis often attempts to extract the voice from the image. So it's pre-recorded, but it's a new lecture prepared especially for us here in Pakistan. And we're only going to have a very short time after the lecture is finished to engage in a discussion if that's what we want to do. But again, keep in mind that this will be recorded and it's automatically being posted to YouTube. So if you'd rather bring your questions to another venue, such as the classroom or the psychoanalysis circle, you can do that as well, and we can explore them together there. Dr. Ellie Ragland is the author of several books, including many sole-authored manuscripts, 5 edited ones as far as I could count, and more than 100 articles. Her work often focuses on psychoanalytic topology and hysteria in the teachings of Sigmund Freud, Jacques Lacan, and Jacques-Alain Miller. And, I'm thinking there was even a moment that took me by surprise when I first read it many years ago in one of Jacques-Alain Miller's seminars, a really important and central seminar where he had been exploring a new clinical category, which was, we could say, neither neurosis nor psychosis, but ordinary psychosis. And you can find a transcript of that if you just search for it online. I believe the text is called Ordinary Psychosis Revisited. And in that text, Ellie Ragland made a significant intervention on the topic and gave a case presentation. I can't remember the name of it now, although it was just in my mind, Mr. Something. I can't remember what it is. But you can go look at it. It's a really fascinating intervention, and just one of many that she had made over the years. And perhaps many of you don't know that Dr. Ragland has been instrumental for Lacanian psychoanalysis in the American continent, and not only in the American continent, but especially in the American continent. In one of our previous issues of the Lacanian Review, which is now available in Pakistan, thankfully we have a subscription to it now, as far as I know, at the Aga Khan University Library. But in that issue, I believe the issue is titled America. We were presented with Jacques-Alain Miller's first seminars in Canada, and perhaps in the United States, at the initiative of Dr. Ragland and her then husband. And I note with interest that Miller had been invited to speak about post-structuralism in a literature department, I believe. But then he advanced forward, far ahead of his time, to outline the difference of psychoanalysis from post-structuralism and structuralism. At a time when very few were reading Lacan at all, Ellie was already, during her PhD dissertation, translating the later and most difficult, perhaps, and obscure teachings of Lacan for English-speaking audiences. She's now retired from the University of Missouri as an emerita professor of English and remains an honorary professor of French. She holds the title of Frederick A. Middlebush Chair, which is a name that I think many of us may want to challenge because of Middlebush's support for segregation in the United States. But it's quite fitting that I think Ellie would hold the title, since so much of her work, in my estimation, challenges from a psychoanalytic point these strange and curious group effects that Lacan had called segregative. She's also a member of the New Lacanian School and the World Association of Psychoanalysis, and she continues to practice psychoanalysis. There's a history of psychoanalysis in America that I don't think can be told without mentioning Dr. Ellie Ragland and her contributions. And the question of hysteria will be key to this historical exploration. So I invite you, if you like, after this talk, to look out for an interview that was conducted with Ellie Ragland in that special issue of the Lacanian Review, conducted by Cyrus Saint-Amand Polyakov, where she's asked about her contributions to the Lacanian orientation in the American continent. You might also be interested in reading an interview that I conducted with Ellie Ragland for the European Journal of Psychoanalysis, which is available for free online if you just search European Journal of Psychoanalysis and Ellie Ragland. I just wanted to provide two more comments before playing the audio lecture. First, it's a quotation from the opening of a talk that Jacques Lacan gave at Yale University in the United States of America early in November of 1974. I'll quote it. "Hysteria produces knowledge. A hysteric is an effect, E-F-F-E-C-T, effect, just as any subject is. Hysterics produce signifying matter to confess, by virtue of which they constitute a discourse. Socrates is the one who started it. Just as any hysteric would, he would deliver anyone's knowledge, knowledge that, in short, he himself was unaware of," end quote. The second quote that I kind of leave you with as we listen to Ellie's talk is from a personal email that Ellie sent me, was it this morning or yesterday? And I'm just extracting this passage. I don't think she would mind that I share it with you. She wrote to me that, I quote, "Hysteria is still relevant today, although it's a nasty word that tends to be dismissed as putting women down. With the decline of the patriarchal family and the rise of liberties for women, identifications with the masculine and or feminine will become ever more confusing for women and some men. For this reason, Lacan's view of hysteria will become more relevant, not less." End quote. It was a message that she sent to me, but I think it's very relevant for setting a context for this talk today. So it's with great enthusiasm and I would say no small degree of pleasure that I'll now play for you this first lecture in our guest lecture series from Dr. Ellie Ragland titled Hysteria. So just bear with me as I get that started.
Hi, my name's Ellie Ragland, and I'm going to give you a paper that I've written called Hysteria. It's a short version of what I'm doing with a book I'm writing right now called Lacan and Hysteria, the Logic of Paradox. Hysteria is a very old word, dating from ancient Greek and Egyptian times, first found on the Kahun, mentioned on the Kahun papyrus in 1900 BCE. In the beginning, the Greek word hystera, meant wandering uterus, taken from the Greek in the 5th century BC by Hippocrates, the father of medicine. There's a book on him called Hippocrates' Women, Reading the Female Body in Ancient Greece. The word described female maladies and their caregivers who advanced causal theories, such as the idea that the womb itself was wandering around in the body of a distraught woman, or that a small animal was wandering around in the body of the woman, the larger body. As the centuries progressed, so did the treatment of this malady, as well as the varying ideas as to its cause. In Greek and Roman times, from the 8th century BC to the 5th century AD, it was thought that an emotional woman could be cured by the rubbing of a petra stone over her body. After Greek and Roman times, the female problem called hysteria disappeared from history, only to reappear with a vengeance in the Middle Ages, approximately 500 to 1500 AD, when the idea of a biological malady became a theological one. Demons were thought to possess the bodies of certain women and sometimes men, causing them to be seductive and dramatic. The women were accused of being witches and were burned at the stake or beheaded. Priests and lords who judged them claimed that by punishing them, they had purified society. One sees a shift from ancient medical concerns regarding a type of feminine woman to a medieval moral judgment of character. In most accusations, the women were told to marry and bear children, that would be a natural cure. The Salem witch trials in the USA ended in 1692, when the Massachusetts governor's wife was accused of being a witch. He put an end to the trials because he disagreed with the accusation of his wife. In the 17th and 18th centuries, theories of the biological causality of hysteria continued to prevail. Small animals, once more, were said to be traveling in the female body. Caregivers, called alienists, because they called their patients aliens. The hysterics were called aliens. It was decided that hysterical problems were caused by an arc of affliction between behavior and female bodily organs, which affected the nervous system. Character and body were united. Uteruses were removed in the 18th and 19th century by those responsible for caring for the ill. Their aim in removing the organs of women was to cure female nerves. They said you can do that by removing the reproductive organs. In the early 19th century, Jean-Martin Charcot, who died in 1893, was considered the founder of modern neurology. He developed his career by trying to understand and treat hysteria. He was given the choice of any post he wanted in the field of neurology, and he chose hysteria. One of his goals was to stop the barbaric surgeries. As a genius anatomist, he was able to do pretty much anything. And people were surprised when he chose the Pitié-Salpêtrière Hospital, where he could work with these troubled women. He learned how to put them, and sometimes men, into a semi-conscious state in which he could change hysterical behaviors into non-hysterical ones by hypnosis, which was at that time the power of suggestion. Or he could produce a hysteria where there had been none. He repeated his demonstrations to his students and then to large audiences, the Tuesday lectures and the Friday demonstrations. He never actually wrote a book on hysteria because his aim was to prove his theories by demonstrating cases of individual sufferers. Nonetheless, he left volumes of pages of meticulous notes where he blamed the cause of hysteria on neurasthenia. Neurasthenia, suffering of the nerves. But he never offered a theory of the causality of this suffering. He tried to equate artistic and photographic images of the women in treatment with their maladies. The demonstration in these photographs of excess emotion was his own proof, he argued. He was showing people who were excessively emotional, and he was taking away the excess in hypnosis. He had pronounced psychological trauma as the cause of male neuroses. He was very interested in male neurosis, male hysteria. But he said the cause of the male neurosis was work accidents or job loss or war trauma. These causes were not assigned to female neurosis. Although he mentioned trauma in relation to women, he kept the other categories for men. He photographed the women in postures that he called clownism, seduction, even lascivious behavior. When he was pressed about the cause of hysteria, he said early on that it was heredity that had come down from some nerve disorder passed through a family. Later, he said the cause was psychological and could be located in the body in an unnamed site in the nervous system. But so important was Charcot's work that Freud first studied with him and then left him and went on to Hippolyte Bernheim's school for treating hysteria in Nancy, France. At that point, theories of the cause of hysteria were basically said to be physical mysteries. Although Freud and Fliess came up with the idea that hysteria was caused by an excess of mucus in the nose. They exchanged letters about this. Although Freud later challenged Fliess for having produced such nonsensical ideas. Many treatments were tried throughout the ages to cure hysteria. A contemporary book written by Rachel Maines argues that pelvic massage was the main method used after witch burning and up until surgery. Pelvic massage was stopped when there was a shaking of the body, basically orgasm. But in those days, when they described their treatment of hysteria, they did not connect the pelvic massages to sex. They called it a cure by hysterical paroxysm. Before Charcot, the importance of using hypnotism in trying to cure hysteria was developed by Franz Anton Mesmer. He invented the theory that hysteria was caused by an excess of animal fluid running in the veins. Again, another biological theory, something wrong in the body. He initiated the use of magnets to try to balance out this mythical fluid which he had invented and which he called a natural source of energy. He was worshipped by many and considered a charlatan by others. James Braid from Scotland saw Mesmer perform and named his process hypnotism. Fans of Mesmer claimed that he gave birth to dynamic psychiatry, but only with Freud was hysteria treated in any progressively modern terms. Freud's treatment methods were first learned from Mesmer and Charcot, and he began using hypnotism by trying to calm his patients by stroking their eyes, for example. But he quickly stopped using hypnosis because it did not work to reduce the patient's resistance to psychoanalysis, that is, to talking about their private lives. It was with Bertha Pappenheim, whom he fictionalized as Anna O, that Freud invented psychoanalysis. Anna O was solicitously treated by Freud's friend Breuer, whose wife became so jealous of his attention to Anna O that Breuer had to stop the treatment. It has been reported that Anna O had a hysterical pregnancy, pseudocyesis it's called, and a miscarriage. But later others have said this is untrue, that there was just a confusion of feelings in the transference. Although Freud never saw Anna O, he commented extensively on her case. You can read it in Studies on Hysteria by Freud and Breuer, which came out in 1895, Volume 2 of the Standard Edition. At one point, Anna O told Breuer that she had come to him to have the leaves swept out of the chimney. That is, to talk away her problems. Freud took this notion from Anna O to mean that patients who came for psychoanalysis had come to talk about things they usually kept private. Thus, the talking cure was born in the clinic of the hysteric. Quickly, sexual causality appeared in Freud's treatments of hysterics following his conversations with them, and he determined that seduction by an uncle or some familiar man was the traumatic cause of hysteria. Not long after proposing this theory, he postulated that the women had not actually been sexually traumatized, that they had just fantasized the sexual ideas. Thus, he placed the idea of fantasy, which he said was often unconscious, at the heart of the psychoanalytic procedure. But what remained at the root of his treatment of hysteria was the idea of sexual causality, whether it had occurred in some older woman who had lost her husband, a nun, or Dora, who had been courted by Herr K, making it possible for her father to carry on a sexual relation with Herr K's wife, Frau K. The cure for hysterics throughout the ages had been said to be regular heterosexual relations. Freud said the same. Another of Freud's well-known cases is that of the young homosexual girl who started courting the village prostitute, courtesan they call them, upon the birth of a baby son to her family. I would suggest that once she was no longer the apple of her father's eye, her name was Marguerite Gretti, they called her, her aim was to displease her father by acting like a boy to a woman, a prostitute. In this way, she was imitating a new child, a boy. I would imagine she would have hidden her attraction to a woman in that era. Most criticisms of this case interpret it in sexual gender terms, accusing the father of being prejudiced against lesbians. In the 20th and 21st century, hysteria has been kept as a diagnosis of seductive, self-centered women whose behavior does not follow the social rules of how a proper woman ought to act. In the American Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is currently being translated into 26 languages, including Japanese and Chinese, hysteria was dropped in the first edition, DSM-1, 1952, but it was included as a mental disorder in DSM-2, 1968. It was rejected again in Manual 3, 1980, which also got rid of the word neurosis. In the DSM-4, hysteria was called, not hysteria, the noun, but an adjective was used, histrionic personality. That came out in 2000. In the DSM-5, which appeared in 2013, both the words hysteria and neurosis are gone. If hysteria is used diagnostically today in the USA, through the DSM system particularly, it is subsumed under the category borderline disorder, which was introduced in 1980 in DSM-3. Leonardo Rodriguez from Melbourne, Australia, has argued that other words are used in all the DSM manuals to describe hysteria as a somatic disorder, an anxiety or depressive disorder, and so on. That is, hysteria has not disappeared from the DSM system, whatever the intentions have been of the American Psychiatric Association, who compiles these manuals. One might wonder where to go to find the reappearance of hysteria as a category of neurosis. The answer is Jacques Lacan, who died in 1981. The French psychoanalyst whose teachings are now spreading worldwide as his difficult theories are gradually being understood and used in the psychoanalytic clinic. When it came to the label of hysteria, Lacan gave the first full-fledged theory of cause that makes psychological sense. Freud had supplanted his interest in hysteria once he introduced the category of fantasy. It turned to other maladies. Moreover, while studying with Charcot, the important thing about Freud's studying of hysteria, however, is that he had transitioned away from neurological thought to the idea that psychology was the cause of mental illness, although he never completely dropped the idea that physiology would one day solve the riddle of the cause of mental illness. Lacan's return to Freud's teachings stands at the base of innovative psychoanalysis today. Since Freud, hysterics have been called daddy's girls. Lacan elaborated a theory that accounts for the taking on of gender as a sexual identity. He included the physical at the level of identification with traits of another person, identification with traits of another person, and proposed that the cause of the hysterics problem is the confusion between being a man or woman. That is to say, confusion in her identification with her father and brothers over identifying with her mother and sisters. Such an identification has nothing to do, however, with Freud's Oedipal model, in which the little girl supposedly matures by turning away from her mother to desiring her father sexually and even wanting a child from him. Rather, Lacan distinguishes between a normal woman, whom he calls feminine, and the hysteric. Although Lacan very often calls the hysteric feminine, in his last teaching, he usually calls the hysteric feminine. There are some Lacanian analysts writing today who say that hysterics are basically males, that their psyche is basically masculine. But that's not how Lacan or Freud talked about it. Many of the Lacanians writing on hysteria say that hysteria is feminine and that obsession is masculine. So you find a confusion among those terms in the literature. Identified with her father or his substitute, the hysteric knows she is a woman, but wants to imitate some characteristics of her father. Thus, her identification centers around the gender aspect of a base identity question. Am I a woman or a man? Knowing she is dually identified, she is in conflict. One of my patients, for example, says that her confusion about her identity started quite young when everybody told her, you have your father's mind. And her father was a very brilliant person, so she always thought, well, I have my father's mind, okay. In the place where Lacan locates subject identity as the agent of speech in his discourse theory, the hysteric is divided, that is, the S is barred. He develops this in seminars 17 and 20. The hysteric speech is marked with the paradox in play in all human subjectivity, except psychosis, where the subject is mentally not divided. But everybody else is divided between conscious and unconscious processes, which create a subject who lacks being whole. Replacing René Descartes' 17th century picture of mentality as the success of joining thought to being, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Lacan argues that subject division means simply that although people take on the language that describes their being and behavior through words, the point is that words only mean anything by pointing to other words. And because of this, there is a linguistic gap between words, between signifiers, the building blocks of language, and the meanings they create, which are eventually called signifieds or knowledge. So the gap would be the S bar of the subject, not the real, as some commentators have said, actually including Zizek. Most subjects fill up this place of lack with objects, as well as with the certainty of their beliefs and opinions. The hysteric, confused about her gender, speaks from uncertainty and doubt, posing a question about identity per se, rather than giving an answer. Her speech poses the ontological question, what is being? In his linguistic-based theory of discourse, Lacan writes the hysteric's discourse as one of four which forms a social link. In the place of the subject as the speaking agent, she is lacking. She's not fully represented by words that convey certainty about her identity. Jacques Miller has described this subject, the hysteric, as two in one, as internally divided within herself. From her place of speech, she targets the other person opposite her for answers to her question, which derive fundamentally from her question about being, about identity. She designates the other as a master. This is all developed in Lacan's discourse theories, where the third discourse is the hysterics discourse. She believes that the master is the one who can give her the answer to who she is, an S1, a master signifier, an identity signifier. The master is either a man or a woman considered to be in the know, who will supposedly tell the hysteric who she is, and she will take an answer from them, albeit temporarily. Because her identity is founded on a question, she eventually subverts the master's answer with another question. In this way, she remains true to the hysteric style of appearing subversive. That is, she gets one answer, but she has another question, so finds another master. But, and this is key in Lacan's teaching, the subversion is based on her identity structure, not on malevolent intentions, or bad behavior. For Lacan, structure concerns a relation to knowledge. The mathem S2 is for knowledge. To power, S1, the master signifier. To desire, the barred S. And to jouissance, the little object A. That's structure. It does not equal behavior, except in a very general sense. Generally, then, in life, an answer follows a question. Before the hysteric, the question remains primary, which is actually one reason Lacan liked to treat hysterics. They always kept going. They didn't resist learning about themselves as other patients did. Lacan's picture of the ego as resistance incarnate and the subject as the anchor to identity places his teaching in opposition to the American DSM system, the one I mentioned before, Diagnostic Manual, which claims that any person can be explained or diagnosed by a description of their behavior. Of course, they keep producing new manuals with new descriptions. Structure, which is for Lacan an organization of space as it creates itself, explains the way any person's quest for knowledge, by which they explain the nature of their being, works to categorize them as normative, which is basically, Lacan doesn't say normative, but as neurotic, psychotic, or perverse. Given that the hysteric depends on questions rather than answers, Lacan argued that this is the only orientation from which psychoanalysis can learn. The analyst Roger Martel argues that analysis can only go forward by learning from hysteria. As Jacques-Alain Miller reminds us, this picture is in direct opposition to the American Analytic Clinic, which obsessionalizes patients, rather than hystericizing them. That is, in the American system, in the DSM thinking system, the idea is that the analyst knows everything and is supposed to educate the patient and treat them how to behave properly. There's no idea that the patient's unconscious desire needs to be unearthed, as they do in the Lacanian clinic. In Lacan's clinic, there's praise. In Lacan's clinic, there is praise for the hysteric, not the condemnation and punishment she has known throughout the centuries. Insofar as the master discourse validates itself by his or her opinions, by having the other person listening to those opinions accept them as correct knowledge, this is the first discourse structure Lacan creates, called the master discourse. the master paradoxically produces the unconscious desire for jouissance, which is aimed at filling in the lack, which is desire seeking jouissance, enjoyment. And this unconscious knowledge in the master discourse reveals itself as the truth of his discourse. But it's unconscious, it's repressed, he resists it, he doesn't know it. Unlike the hysteric, for whom it's at the service of speech, it's buried from the master. Known for speaking the truth, which others hide or deny, the hysteric sees through the master's masquerade of pretense, which takes its own unconscious knowledge to be its own conscious knowledge to be the sum of what there is to be known. His failure, the master's, lies in repressing the lack in being, his lack in being, or her, which is the equivalent of denying the knowledge of the unconscious. If the hysteric chooses an academic as a master, he will offer her the theory of knowledge that is currently in vogue, the rating theory that he prefers. His goal is to identify with his unconscious knowledge. He wants her to identify with his conscious knowledge. Like the psychoanalyst, whose idea of treatment is that a patient identify with them as healthy, the academic, the professor, also tries to bury the other person, the patient, the student. They try to bury their unconscious desire. They do not want to work with something that the other needs to seek out. Lacan praises the hysteric's discourse as being closer to the unconscious than that of the master or university discourse. The university discourse taking the professor's conscious knowledge to be the truth, by which he or she will seduce their students into identification with their knowledge rather than with the student's unconscious desires. The analyst who aims the cause of desire at the lack in being, that is, the subject speaking agent in the analyst discourse, is the object A itself, the cause of desire, which aims at the other at the point of the lack in their being. So the analyst and the hysteric are on the same path in discourses, on the path toward unconscious knowledge, rather than the master or professor who pretend that conscious knowledge equals truth. The analyst consciously seeks the truth of the unconscious from his patient, while the hysteric cannot help speaking from the knowledge produced by the master whom she queries, by linking it to the cause of her desire, which resides in the place of truth in her discourse. Nonetheless, the answer that she takes as truth will change over time as she goes further in probing the knowledge she's seeking. The hysteric's discourse leads her from doubt back to a question of whether the other has the true answer to her identity quandary, giving her a kind of natural defense. I mean, she doesn't have to be under the victim of the authority of the master, which is the way some people portray her, which is incorrect, because she's not able to stick just with one master, unless she goes through a psychoanalytic cure and comes to the point of her own mastery in terms of working with her identity question. But the hysteric suffers. Identified as she is with lack in being, she must continually work in order to know where to place herself in society. Am I a man or a woman is for her a paradoxical dilemma. It is not a question of being one sex and then the other, or it's not a question of being transgendered. She is, as Miller says, in internal division. She is both one and the other. She seeks a positive logic that will allow a negative to become affirmative. She may idealize certain types of men and even sometimes have disdain for women, and in that she would not be a feminist. But many hysterics are very successful at filling in the lack in being, and are feminists or are highly acclaimed by feminists. Their own ambivalence can paradoxically drown or promote them. Since the hysteric is not certain of her being as a woman, she imitates other women, or she may identify herself on the masculine side. Typical of women who identify as a man to succeed are many of Tirso de Molina's heroines. He was a Spanish playwright in the Spanish Golden Age. Many of his heroines dress as men. Cross-dressing is a big theme in his plays. Literature is replete with hysterical types of women, such as Emma Bovary, who sought to prove herself as a woman by finding the most romantic man as a lover, although the novel ends tragically for Emma. Another type of hysteric is the heroine of Charlotte Perkins Gilman's Yellow Wallpaper. Seen as highly nervous, she's given the treatment for hysterics at the time that novel was written, which was the rest cure. If a woman was over-dramatic, over-emotional, couldn't solve her problems, they were said that they should rest, they should sleep, that their body was tired. When the heroine of Yellow Wallpaper heroically tried to get up and accomplish artistic endeavors, she was sent back to bed to rest. Another type of hysteric is described by Edith Wharton in House of Mirth. The young woman tries to solve her identity confusion, which was created by her own mother, who said that her daughter wasn't pretty enough to be a socialite. That's the theme of the novel, House of Mirth, mirth meaning it's not so funny. Anna Karenina is another. Joan of Arc is iconic. Julia Child is a contemporary hysteric whose charisma is infectious. She laughingly says that she does not know which piece of cutlery to use in her cooking, but that her husband organizes all that for her. But more typically, hysterics are not able to resolve their gender confusion except by suffering, often because they are punished by society for being different. Juliet Mitchell depicts Dora, Freud's Dora case, as being a typical hysteric because of her bodily illnesses that imitate her father's and her brother's illnesses. It is true that Dora, who was a teenager when she saw Freud, grew up to marry and have one son, who interestingly became the director of the San Francisco Opera House. Dora, however, Ida Bauer was her name, she spent her life suffering from one illness after another. But when Freud saw her, he was not interested in her bodily suffering except to note her identification with her father's chronic throat illnesses through her own aphonia, that she couldn't speak, couldn't get her voice out. But one cannot reduce bodily affliction to hysteria because bodily affliction affects all types of people. In that the hysteric sees the non-rapport between men and women, her quest to be made whole by love is fruitless. That is, if she sees that there's a lack in this man that she's seeking as an ideal to replace her supposedly ideal father, she can't lie to herself, at least in the unconscious, saying that they are 100% a match. Analysis can offer the hysteric the cure of not being burdened by bringing her to see that all quests in a non-rapport. The hysteric who denies that the sexual difference makes a difference is not unlike the feminist who argues that because men and women are equal, they are the same. In this, the hysteric who would say that the sexual difference makes no difference would be like the feminist who argues that men and women are equal and the same. The point being that men and women, being equal in all kinds of things, brain power, all kinds of areas, are not the same. No person is another person. That's what Lacan stresses, that each subject is singular. So women and men are different. Men are different from each other. Women are different from each other. In saying that, insofar as identification of same to the same is an impossible logic, A cannot equal A, the hysteric unconsciously acknowledges what Lacan called castration. That is, castration is the acceptance of difference. Difference is a formulaic concept, an axiom of the human that Lacan teaches us to acknowledge, because the way in which one embraces castration, that prefigures the lack in being, is the way one embraces their subjectivity and their being in the world. This occurs at the beginning of life for most subjects, except the psychotic. The hysteric manages with her lack in being by seeking the semblant of a master. That is to say, she'll be completed by another whom she considers a master. When the masters she chooses are lost, symbolized by the phallus or the S1, she falls into a state of anxiety and loss. The psychoanalytic cure for this, the hysteric in a state of anxiety and loss, is sought through her examining her primordial relationship to language, where jouissance and desire are first joined together, not through an interpretation of her unconscious per se. That is, she needs to understand the signifiers in synchronic time that are important to her, and the jouissance that she seeks, which was established over diachronic time, that is, throughout her life. The diachronic time of repressed memories is not lost, but clusters around the synchronic signifiers and the object A that causes desire. Lacan rewrote Ferdinand de Saussure's notion of the signifier and signified, inverting them. De Saussure had said that the signified creates a signifier, that is, that knowledge creates language. And Lacan says that language creates knowledge, which was a radical move. The signifier creates a signified, it's not the reverse. So in any study of language, the primary thing on the side is the signifier. In the sign is the signifier, not the signified. The object A stands in for objects that cause one to desire. Could be a child wanting its bottle, a rich man wanting to buy a yacht. Any object that substitutes for the primordially lost objects, the breast, feces, urinary flow, imaginary phallus, phoneme, gaze, voice, and the nothing. Lacan calls these 8 objects primordially lost. The child gets the mother's breast, and the telephone rings, and the mother gets up, and there's no one-to-one fusion that remains all the time in the primary part of life for any of us. Substitute objects fill in the gap created by the loss of these primary objects for most people. But the hysteric is always thrown off her own fulfillment by the fact that she knows she is castrated, not whole. Nestor Bronstein, who wrote a beautiful book on jouissance, he recently died, his book should be read, he quotes Lacan regarding this. The quote is, "She will deceive herself by identifying the demand of the other big O, meaning society, culture, identifying the demand of the other with the desire of the other. She will have to live so as to complete the other. To offer herself, she will live so as to offer herself as the object who hides the other's castration, which appears from when, thanks to this fake appendix, regarding his own completeness, he or she, instead of taking the place of the master and lord of jouissance, puts herself in the inaccessible place of the urfather." This is an idea that Freud developed, the idea that the primordial father, the urfather, the primal father, was a point of identification of the child going away from the mother to the father. This is Lacan's mirror stage, in which the child has to break the symbiotic idea that it's one with the mother, the baby, by referring to the outside world, the social, to language, to the third term in the child-mother triangle, the third term being the father, or someone who represents a third term, a priest, a lawyer, an uncle. It could even be a woman in a lesbian couple, one who takes the position of mother, the other takes the position of the outside. This idea that Bronstein talks about identifying the demand of the other, demand means the other asks something of you, put your toys away, with the desire of the other. They're not just telling you to do it, but they want you to do it, so you need to move. You can't just say, "Oh, be quiet, I'll put them away an hour later." The other desires that you do it, and you need to engage your desire to the other's demand. This was Lacan's theory regarding hysteria in Seminar 8, the idea that the hysteric had to identify with the place of the urfather. It's, of course, something Lacan develops this idea in Seminar 8, the transference, 1960-61. The theory, of course, is based on Freud's totem and taboo, where he has the idea that the brothers have killed the primal father, the urfather, and they end up not just being each one the lord of jouissance, but be guilty in having to band together to create something that will be a society based on law. This is the way Lacan interprets the myth of totem and taboo. Anyway, Lacan quickly dropped this theory of identification with the urfather because the libidinal position of the other, big O, is too uncertain for the hysteric to retain it as an absolute fantasy. In other words, Bronstein believed that the other, big O, was equal to the urfather, and that was based on Lacan's early teaching. His book on jouissance came out a long time ago. But Lacan dropped this idea by 1961. One of my patients expressed the jouissance she felt when her father would look at her report card and ask her why there was a minus beside an A grade. This was not taken as a criticism by her, but simply fueled her desire to work even harder to please him. Another problem for the hysteric seeking to reify her ideal ego as an ego ideal in the eyes of the other comes from her representing her father, whose flaws she sees, whose castration she sees, but she must represent him as uncastrated. She denies his castration. Thus, the hysteric seeks to place both herself and her father in a subject position that is false, one which retained him as an imaginary ideal. Neither can he nor his substitutes appease her unconscious fantasy of a real ideal father. She suffers nonetheless, as do other subjects, from the presence of the real, as the return of the repressed, in La Langue and in the partial drives. Lacan calls the partial drives the oral, anal, invocatory, and scopic. He's added invocatory, vocal, and scopic, eyes, the gaze, to Freud's oral and anal. The hysteric certainty, her denial, creates her as a symptom, composed of the knot of the body, which links together the imaginary, identification, language, the symbolic, and the real, the drives, place of trauma. Lacan taught that James Joyce was able to learn enough languages to sustain his voice for writing fiction that qualified him as a famous writer, even though his final novel, Finnegan's Wake, was undecipherable. Thus, the unconscious enters language and the body in the real time of the drives and in the symptom. This is Lacan. For Joyce, the symptom was his voice, through which he managed to thread together enough languages to keep himself from having a psychotic break. Lacan develops this in Seminar 23, Le Symptôme, in 75-76. Finnegan's Wake, Lacan says, displays the reverse side of ordinary language, as it is disordered in a psychotic's mind. The baby begins to learn language from about 6 to 18 months. First created as a word that Lacan makes up. He puts together langue, which means spoken language, with the language, la langue. He makes it one word. Language that is learned from the primordial mother in a symbiotic oneness that excludes the principle of thirdness, which is differentiation or castration. The father's name, signifier, which is a function. This is also the site where the fundamental fantasy begins to be created as some myth of wholeness that will sustain unconscious knowledge and gradually develop into the symptom that is singular for each subject, and the symptom out of which each one acts from the other, big O, that inscribed him for knowledge. That is the set of signifiers that the big other represents. Psychosis in Lacan's teaching results from an infant forming a primordial oneness with the mother and foreclosing, one word, the signifier for a father's name that functions as the signifier no. The signifier no delineates both the logic of difference and what we call law. Law basically means something that sets down a rule which makes distinctions between what is okay and what isn't. The hysteric symptom is not only that she is split between identification as a man and a woman, but in addition that she suffers from the fact that there is no signifier for the woman in the unconscious. There is one signifier for man, the phallus, which denotes both difference and lack. That is to say, he has an imaginary organ which she, the woman, does not have. So the couple, male, female, set up the visual logic of difference very early on. All kinds of other things are going on that are setting up the logic of difference, such as difference between the signifier and signified, and the way language is learned to create gaps. The hysteric's quest for knowledge, as identity, is given greater importance by Jacques-Alain Miller's adding the discourse of knowledge as a fifth one to Lacan's four: master, university, hysteric, and analyst. Miller develops this in his seminar of 2010-2011, The One All Alone, where he stresses the interplay of synchronic and diachronic cells. Given her search for truth qua knowledge, the hysteric unveils the lies, uncertainty, and repression, the lies by which master discourse people live. She does this by placing the surplus value of jouissance on what, for her, equals the knowledge of the real as certitude, not just symbolic conventions or imaginary semblances, that is, appearances. This then is a different kind of knowledge than that of the university discourse, the French word savoir, or the discourse of opinion spoken by the master, the French word connaissance, for knowledge. In my view, the hysteric's question about sexuated identity does not reveal an interest in reproduction per se, the signifier for mother being of little interest to her. But since she is preoccupied with the place of the body in identity, she necessarily learns about sexuality. This does not mean that she is promiscuous, only that she wants to know about sex. This is typical of Freud's Dora case. Dora was obliged to babysit the children of Frau K and Herr K to allow her father, Herr Bauer, to continue his adulterous relation with Frau K. Dora accepted Herr K's gifts and attentions for 4 years to allow her father to continue his liaison with Herr K's wife. The comfortable arrangement ended the second time Herr K tried to kiss Dora. She slapped him and caused chaos in the agreement that had endured since she was 14 years old. Her father took her to see Freud because she had reported Herr K tried to kiss her and said that she slapped him. I just got 3 more pages. She left Freud after 11 weeks, but returned a year later to boast that she had exposed the affair between her father and Frau K, as well as Herr K's unwanted attention. She had exposed this to her whole family. She also reported that many of her physical symptoms had disappeared. One could say that Dora dropped her hysteria once she ceased to idealize her father by supporting his indiscretion. I have suggested in my book that although Freud and all commentators have considered his treatment of Dora to be a failure, that after talking to him, she did have the courage to end the years-long complicity of which she had been a part, and she went back to see him to brag about it. Hysteria dramatizes the general confusion of tone that is a particular kind of gender impasse that arises out of the cultural imposition of sex and identity as holistic. Lacan taught that division, loss, fragmentation, lack, drives, and the void all lie under some supposed unity of the imaginary subject's body and symbolic linguistic identity. Lacking unity, the hysteric speech earns the place of being a discourse nonetheless. That is, a discourse for Lacan's what makes a social link. Through transference, that is, by believing in the other, and even that the other can answer her question as truth. She's not just adapting or accommodating to the other. Rather than the IPA, International Psychoanalytic Association, or object relations views of hysteria as sexual repression, Lacan was interested in the sexual dilemma created by the subject's not accepting herself as an object created for another. Not only does her split in identity between the masculine and feminine give her no representative signifier such as wife, mother, mistress, and so on, but the split itself creates a dilemma in which the unconscious interferes overtly in conscious life by refusing cultural binary prototypes of the sexual relation. By remaining attached to an idealized version of the phallic signifier, qua father's name, the effect being a failure to rupture the imaginary order, the hysteric remains appended from the phallic signifier as a subject lacking a place, She doesn't know where to place herself as a phallic signifier. Is she the beloved? Is she the one who represents difference? Is she the one who represents sameness? She doesn't know where to place herself. Her dilemma is not that of the transsexual or transgender person, wherein the subject wants to be the opposite sex from his or her biological one. That is to say, a transgender person is not confused between am I a woman or a man in terms of psychic identity. Psychically, the mental identity is that they know that they may be a man biologically, but psychologically they're a woman. And often the transgendered people have surgeries to make their bodies fit their psyches. Nor is hysteria the androgynous search for a myth of harmony and oneness, what Jung called the joining of the anima and animus, masculine and feminine principles. The split at the surface of hysterical consciousness reveals the hidden truth about the unconscious as being unwelcome in conscious life, and perforce demonstrating that there is no natural or original being. The hysteric demonstrates opposite sides of being, showing her difficulty, the impossibilities of everyday life, which she nonetheless thinks she can surmount. Because she has difficulties fitting in with the normativity of her symbolic sphere, her defensive responses may seem unruly or even revolutionary. In contemporary life, I think this is quite different in the sense that from the day Freud wrote, even from Lacan's writings on hysteria, there are many symbolic spheres. There's gay symbolic sphere, gay men symbolic sphere, lesbian symbolic sphere, transgender symbolic sphere, heteronormative symbolic sphere. So the point about the hysteric being unruly and revolutionary is that she was that for the society before there was the gender fluidity that marks contemporary society. Moreover, her desire hides the passivity of the Lacanian subject, driven as it is by the language and thought of signifiers. I would argue that this only hides an even more basic passivity that has sometimes been attributed to the hysteric. Having no clear subject identity, she sacrifices her being embodied to the other's desire, big O other, aiming to identify with some other consistency, rather than with her own fantasy that her father is uncastrated. I mean, she has confusion between am I a man or a woman, and also the unconscious dialectic of who is castrated and who isn't. While most contemporary books on hysteria portray her as a victim or a heroine, one can think of Florence Nightingale as sacrificing herself to the wounded soldiers in war, as a prototype of the hysteric, lost in the infinity of all or nothing, victim and heroine. Even though the hysteric does not make metaphor well, that is, substitute one thing for another, metaphor is the formal envelope of the human body event, according to Lacan. Although hysterical symptoms take on the character of their social order, typical bodily metaphors have been repeated over centuries in hysterical conversion reactions, such as swollen lips, globus hystericus, blindness, paralyzed limbs, vomiting, eating disorders. You might say, well, only eating disorders of that category remain. But I would point out an example of a patient of mine, something that happened quite recently. The patient started dating a man when she was an adult in graduate school. And the man she started dating had the same name as her brother. Every time, curiously, he would come to the door to take her out for a date, knock on the door. Her lips would swell to twice their size, meaning that his name and her brother's name had some sexual effect on her body. She did not remember having been ever sexually attracted to her brother in childhood or in adulthood, but unconsciously it must have been there. Eventually, she simply quit dating the man because the problem wouldn't go away. And it didn't ever happen with anyone else. Miller has recently described such metaphors as showing a fixation to jouissance. The hysteric symptoms, whether from the past or contemporary moment, make it clear that there is no original mind-body split. By dismissing Freud's totalizing ego as a mediator and maintaining rather Freud's original identity split between the ideal ego and the ego ideal, Lacan demonstrates the more than knowledge in knowledge, hysteria revealing the unnatural basis of assigning sexual differences based on biology rather than desire. When I think of that, I think of the song A Boy Named Sue. Everybody might laugh at that song, but what about the mother's unconscious desire? What does she want, a boy or a girl? Lacan says that what the mother wants and thinks before the baby is born begins to influence the way language is taught to the baby, even from birth on. The hysteric unveils an unwelcome truth. Because there is no primordial signifier for the woman, and because the man is defined as castrated, not because of the imaginary organ difference, but because he has joined a group of brothers who live with guilt under the law after having killed the primal father. Because of this, there is a hole at the center of knowledge itself. It's the other bard in Lacan. At the level of symptoms, this hole creates anxiety for her. Thus, hysteria, in unveiling the real, what she's certain about, is that which language tries to close out by tripping over it. She makes herself a problem for those who want things to just work smoothly. Miller stresses that the real of the hysteric's encounters exclude her from easy social inclusions. Although Lacan describes hysteria as a structure meant to stave off anxiety, paradoxically, it produces it. Hysteria does, in contemporary life, even remain a problem for some different groups. There are many women who feel that to leave men is the only superior move for a feminist, for a woman, and to have a relation with a woman. The hysteric doesn't fit in well with that group, although she may be friends with many of the women. They want her to be sexually like them. I wouldn't say that the hysteric is necessarily bisexual. I'm sure some are. But her confusion is not necessarily primarily sexual. It's psychological. It's identity. It's being. Although the hysteric will always retain the structure of her being, something which cannot be cured once and for all, psychoanalysis can change the impossible from which she suffers to the contingent, certainties to uncertainties, and inconsistencies. Lacan turned to mathematical topology, surface topology, and then the topology of knots, to show that contradictory material functions in psychic space in a non-binary way. Usually when we see inside-outside, we think inside versus outside, and Lacan showed that the inside-outside are connected, that it's not a versus relationship. Think of the figure 8, the Mobius strip, connected by the twist in the middle, which Jean Lafont says marks the point of the drives. Contradictions mark the symptom, while they also can be questioned, and the impossible can become possible. I think of a patient who became unable to go to school in the 2nd grade once her father was hospitalized. When the school bus would appear, she fainted. The problem was solved by her teacher, who lived near her house. The teacher called her mother and said, "I will come and take her to school in my car and then bring her home," which she did, until her father returned home, at which point the little girl continued to take the bus. By the early 1900s, Freud sought the cure of hysteria by dropping the somatoform symptoms that had been focused on for centuries. In 1908, he proposed two types of hysteria, conversion and anxiety. As Lacan pointed out in Seminar 4 on the object relation, 1956-57, symptoms of inhibition, which are symbolic, frustration, which are imaginary, and anxiety, which are real, bring unconscious material into bodily awareness. Lacan argued that we are not bodies, however, but that we have bodies taken on in bits and pieces. With your little baby, you say, this is your nose, you play with the fingers, here is Thumpkin, here comes Tall Man, here comes Pinky, same with the toes, you name them. The hysteric often uses her body as a defense against the other's desire. The psychoanalytic change that would work as a kind of cure of hysterical symptoms occurs when the fundamental fantasy she has allows her to move from an imago to telling her fantasy, to living out and living with and being creative with the symptom that she is. Lacan has defined hysteria as the assumption of deprivation, yet the hysteric may appear very strong in her effort to repair her father's castration and thus her own. Lacanian analysts aim to help the hysteric fabricate a new master signifier at the level of subject identity. This gives her a chance to place herself in the symbolic both as subject and object. In explaining his admiration for hysteria, Lacan says in the Rome Discourse, 1953, that the hysteric's revelation of the past vacillates between the imaginary and the real. What is to be found there is what he calls the birth of truth in speech, pointing to the reality of neither true nor false, what Miller calls the lying truth. Miller calls the hysteric's discourse an epistomophony, revealing that the truth that underlies knowledge, which most people mount as a semblant or an appearance, they call that not their knowledge, she shows not as a semblance, but that the truth is basically the nonsense of the master. Thus, hysteria manifests the unconscious as other begot, while she herself is caught in the impasse of paradox. She cannot be a part of the male sex, a closed group marked by castration and subsequent obedience to the law. Given that her picture of man is based on the fantasy misrecognition of her father as ideal, the only hope left is for her to shatter the imaginary father she has constructed. In analysis, she passes from transference love, based on an old image, to a new imaginary that allows her to place herself differently as an object in the symbolic, and thereby she acquires a new signifier for identity and a new relationship to the drives. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. That went a little bit longer than I was expecting. We've only got 5 minutes, which I don't believe is enough time for questions, although I expect there are a lot of questions. I'm really happy when there are. I have a lot of questions. So my suggestion to all of you is bring your questions with you to our Psychoanalysis Pakistan WhatsApp group or to the class, those of you who are in the psychosocial pathologies class. And we can discuss them there privately amongst ourselves. Thanks, everybody. I hope you have a great rest of your Saturday. Bye-bye.